Equity. The principles of fairness and balance that underlie the reciprocity norm are related to two other social needs. One is the need for equity. Equity exists when people in a relationship believe there is a balance of fairness between what they contribute to the relationship and what they receive from it. When people perceive an imbalance, they are motivated to restore equity. There is considerable evidence showing equity motives in helping. People who have unfairly received benefits, for example, those who receive too much reward based on their contribution to a group activity, often freely choose to give up some of their reward. The key element here is that people perceive that they have been unfairly overcompensated. This does not always happen. Because people tend to overestimate the value of their contributions, they typically believe they have earned, and thus deserve, what they have received. On the other hand, if people feel they have been undercompensated, they will contribute less. George, 1991, found, for example, that workers who felt they had been treated unfairly were less helpful to others and to their organization as a whole. That is, workers who felt they received less than they gave were less likely to go beyond what was required of them on the job. The need to see the world as fair and just is also central to Melvin Lerner's just world hypothesis, 1980. The central aspect of the belief in a just world is that good things happen to good people and that bad things happen to bad people. Thus, one reason why people help others may be because it is a virtuous act that makes them feel that they are deserving of good fortune. Conversely, under some circumstances, not helping may make them seem like a bad person and consequently deserving of ill fortune. For example, in one set of studies by Zuckerman, 1975, students who believed more strongly in a just world, based on their scores on the belief in a just world scale, were more likely to volunteer to serve in an experiment and more likely to donate their time to read to a blind person shortly before taking an exam, but not shortly after the exam. Presumably, helping others was a way for students to establish that they deserved the good fortune of a just world when it came time to take their exam. Like equity theory, the just world hypothesis suggests that people will be motivated to help others who have been treated unfairly, to make the world fair and just again. Moreover, because of the need to see the world as just, people, particularly those with a stronger belief in a just world, may be more likely to help those who have been injured unfairly. Bernhoff et al. 1991, for instance, interviewed people who helped victims of actual traffic accidents and a sample of people, matched for age, sex, and socioeconomic status, who did not help the victims. Those who helped believed more strongly in a just world than those who did not. However, there are other responses to another's misfortune that can also make the world appear just. Besides helping or compensating the victim, one could punish the perpetrator or come to believe that the victim got what he or she deserved. In fact, Lerner and his colleagues have shown that people will often devalue an innocent victim because they are motivated to see the world as just. In general, if helping is possible and does not require undue commitment, most people will choose to help. However, if a person cannot be helped or the investment for helping is substantial, the just world hypothesis suggests that people will not help and instead will derogate the victim, which makes the world seem right again but in a different way. Innocent people do not suffer unfairly, thus victims must not actually be innocent, but rather are simply getting what they deserve. Illustrative of this idea, Fernham, 1995, found that the more strongly English students believed in a just world, the more negative were their views of people with disabilities, and Applebaum, 2002, demonstrated that German students who believed in a just world were more likely to be opposed to disadvantaged groups receiving government aid. This tendency to blame the victim may explain why innocent victims of crimes, e.g. victims of rape, are sometimes accused of being responsible for their victimization, of asking for it, by their dress or being in the wrong place. Ironically, the need to see the world as just leads people to make unfair judgments about what people deserve based on what they have received. For example, The recent People's Courts in Rwanda are attempting to establish a collective sense of justice for past injuries in the genocide that occurred there in 1994, a step that can be instrumental for achieving reconciliation. These deliberations will require a careful framing of the causes of the genocide in a way that evokes sympathy and understanding for the victims rather than blaming them. Rationalizations that blame the victim could lead to re-traumatization and a rekindling of hostilities among the people of Rwanda. The norm of social responsibility. According to this social norm, people are expected to help others who are dependent on them. Much of the classic work in this area was conducted by Leonard Berkowitz. In a series of experiments, students assembled paper envelopes under the supervision of another student. They were told that their work was actually a test of the other person's supervisory skill. Berkowitz and his colleagues varied how much the students believed the evaluation of the supervisor would depend on their performance. In general, the participants in this study were socially responsible. Even when there was no possible gain for themselves, students were more motivated to work when the consequences for the supervisor were greater. 1963. The norm of social responsibility also explains why, as we saw in Chapter 3, people are more likely to help others who are physically handicapped and who are seen as having a significant need. Clark, 1975. People's willingness to help others who are dependent on them has its limits, however. There are several exceptions to this rule. One involves why people are dependent. As we show later when Weiner's attributional model is presented, people have different reactions when a problem is caused by the person rather than by forces beyond the person's control. People are reluctant to help others whose own behavior caused their dependency. For example, if people believe that African Americans' disadvantaged economic status is due more to lack of effort than to social barriers, they are less likely to support social welfare programs designed to help the disadvantaged. Similarly, people are less likely to support programs to help welfare recipients than they are to help the poor. Presumably, this reaction is because of stereotypes that welfare recipients are more personally responsible for their needy situation than are the poor in general. Students are also less sympathetic and less likely to help a person who developed AIDS through sexual promiscuity than through a blood transfusion. 1988. In general, the perceived controllability of a person's problem is one of the major determinants of whether others will feel sympathy when the need has an uncontrollable cause, or anger when the need has a controllable cause, which, in turn, influences whether people respond helpfully or aggressively. As we show in Chapter 7, individual differences matter as well. Different people respond in various ways to others' situations. Linda Skitka, 1999, showed how liberals and conservatives responded to victims of a natural disaster. Telephone interviewers contacted a representative sample of over 1,000 people across the United States to assess their reaction to victims of massive flooding of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers at the time. The interviewers described 3 different towns that had taken various measures in the past to control flooding. One town had increased taxes substantially to build a flood wall. A second town had voted against such action because the wall would have ruined the view of the river, which was a major tourist attraction and an important economic factor for the community. A third town did not build a flood wall because the community had voted down the increase in taxes that was needed for the construction. Thus, the towns varied in their attempts, through prior planning and commitment, to protect themselves against flooding. In general, people were more supportive of federal assistance for the communities that had demonstrated more efforts to protect against the river flooding. However, liberals and conservatives responded differently. Liberals were less concerned about the community's preparation than were conservatives. They supported aid for all 3 communities, regardless of the previous action to prepare for the flood. In contrast, conservatives were strongly influenced by prior preparation, supporting significantly more aid for the community that had already built the flood wall than for the other 2 towns, making their support for aid to the 2 other towns contingent on future reform. There are also many differences across groups and cultures that influence reactions to dependencies. As we noted in Chapter 3, some cultures are more individualistic, oriented toward individual gain and responsibility. Others are more collectivistic, directed toward the group welfare. The Americans and British tend to be individualistic, whereas the Chinese and Japanese tend to be collectivistic. As one consequence, people in these cultures may respond differently to others' dependency. Chinese psychologist Hing-Kyung Ma, 1985, asked people in London and in Hong Kong their reactions to a range of other people's problems. Hong Kong residents appeared more responsive to the needs of others. These feelings of social responsibility to help, among collectively oriented people, are particularly strong for others, even strangers, who are perceived to be part of their group. There have also been traditional gender differences within the United States. Women are generally more sensitive to the dependency of others than are men. In fact, men often respond to people who are very dependent on them by providing less rather than more help. Enzel and Harvey, 1979. Thus, the norm of social responsibility is only a general rule. It does not apply equally in all situations or to all people. Personal norms and standards. Although general norms of social responsibility may provide only vague guides for behavior in concrete situations, the use of personal norms and standards is valuable for predicting how a particular person will behave in a specific situation. According to Schwartz and Howard, 1981, personal norms are feelings of moral obligation to perform or refrain from specific action. Personal norms are generated in a specific situation by a person considering what the possible choices are and the implications of such actions for personal norms and values. The more central these personal standards are, the stronger will be the emotional arousal associated with acting or not acting in a certain way. Personal norms do predict actual helping. For example, personal norms have been found to correlate significantly with such prosocial behaviors as giving blood or bone marrow, tutoring blind children, and working with elderly welfare recipients. The average correlation, however, is usually quite low, around 0.3. The influence of personal norms on helping behavior is greatly increased. However, if dispositional tendencies, such as an awareness of consequences, i.e., the extent to which people notice others' needs spontaneously, and denial of responsibility, i.e., the extent to which individuals accept excuses for inaction under circumstances that arouse personal normative standards, are also considered. For individuals who are high on awareness and low on denial, the correlations between personal norms and actions are often close to 0.5. The most striking finding of this kind involved asking Israeli students about their willingness to tutor blind children and then observing their actual behavior. For students high on denial, the correlation was negative 0.03. Essentially, no relationship was found between their words and deeds. However, among those low in denial of responsibility, there was a correlation of 0.72 between their personal norms and actions. These people put their money, or in this case, their time, where their mouths were. 1981. The impact of personal norms also depends on how much people think about the normative standards. If you hold a personal norm that you should help in a particular situation, focusing on that norm should increase helping. Focusing your attention inward produces a state called objective self-awareness, in which you are likely to compare yourself to some important standard or ideal behavior. If these standards involve helping, you will be more likely to help. The research on personal norms and standards converges to make a relatively clear picture. People who possess standards of helping in specific areas will be inclined to help. Whether they ultimately help, however, depends on whether they attend to these norms and accept personal responsibility for helping. This topic also introduces a critical issue that we consider in detail in Chapter 7, differences among people in their willingness to help. Nevertheless, even though people may have different standards and norms, the nature of the motivation to help, to meet those standards and satisfy feelings of moral obligation, may be fundamentally similar. Feelings and helpfulness. Although our behavior is guided by thoughts, cognitions, it is also greatly influenced by what we feel, affect. We are both logical and emotional beings. In this section, we explore a third class of reasons why people help. We examine how different emotions motivate helping, often in different ways. For over 100 years, psychologists have recognized that arousal is a fundamental element of emotions. Potential helping situations thus typically involve emotional experiences for potential helpers because they are usually arousing. People are aroused by the distress of others. This reaction occurs even among very young children and occurs across cultures. In fact, this phenomenon is so strong and universal that some researchers have proposed that empathic arousal generated vicariously by another person's distress, has a biological and evolutionary basis. Humans may be inherently empathic creatures. The role of empathic emotions in prosocial motivation is the focus of several arousal and affect models of helping. Although many researchers agree that empathic arousal is an important and fundamental human emotion, there is much less agreement about how it feels to be empathic and how this emotion actually motivates people to help. In general, the emotions that people feel are at least partially determined by how they interpret the arousal that they are experiencing. Physiologically, there are few differences in the nature of the arousal between different emotions. Therefore, people may interpret unexplained arousal as fear if they are around frightened people. The same physiological arousal may be experienced as anger if they are around angry people. Schrachter and Singer, 1962. For instance, male participants who walked across a narrow suspension bridge, which normally made people anxious and aroused, felt more romantically interested in a physically attractive female experimenter than did those who walked across a more stable bridge with her. Dudden and Aaron, 1974. Thus, depending on the situation, arousal may sometimes be interpreted as one emotion, sometimes as a somewhat different emotion, misattributed. Recall the last time you came home late and your parents were waiting up for you. How quickly did their arousal, which they had been interpreting as worry, become reinterpreted as anger? Similarly, empathic arousal may produce different emotions. Emotions are complex experiences. In Chapter 3, we explained how and why feeling good promotes helping. We were careful to note, however, that this does not imply that negative moods necessarily suppress helping. In fact, some negative emotions can lead people to be more helpful. Moreover, the emotional responses that a person can experience in a potential helping situation, which might be generally classified as negative affect, can be quite varied and can reflect very different subjective experiences. For example, research indicates that in serious emergency situations, bystanders usually become upset and distressed, but in less critical, less intense situations, observers may feel sad, tense, or even concerned and compassionate. Historically, social psychologists treated motives rather broadly and compared how positive versus negative feelings affected people's behavior. More recently, researchers have focused more of their attention on the causes and consequences of particular or specific emotions, so-called differentiated emotions. They believe that the particular emotion a person experiences critically shapes a person's motivation and behavioral orientation to others. For example, some emotions, such as disgust, produce avoidance of others, whereas other emotions, such as sympathy, lead us to approach others. Even negative emotions differ substantially in their action tendencies. Anger leads to action against another person or group, whereas fear promotes avoidance. We adopt this latter, more differentiated approach for understanding the role of emotion for prosocial motivation. Emotions and helping. People can experience a number of different emotions when they see another person's need or problem. Some, such as upset and distress, may result from intense arousal generated from an emergency that places the person in an unexpected and unfamiliar situation in which there is great time pressure, and the possibility is high that another person may be injured or harmed in some way. Other emotions, such as discomfort, cognitive dissonance, may be based on the perception of injustice, that someone is in an unfair circumstance. Still other emotions, such as sympathy and compassion, may reflect a primary concern for the welfare of a specific other person. Over the past 30 years, social psychologists have devoted considerable time and energy debating the different motivational properties of these emotional reactions. We do not focus on the details of this debate. Instead, drawing on the more general research of differentiated emotion, we consider the factors that shape the emotion a person experiences and then consider the particular motivating properties of these different emotions for helping.